In northern Greece, a mountain juts straight out of the Aegean Sea, formed by a ridge that rides throughout the entire peninsula. It culminates in a majestic summit right before the water, and dotted along this rocky coastline are 20 monasteries. This is Mount Athos, the spiritual center of all Orthodox Christianity. The name Mount Athos translates to the Holy Mountain. It's a semi-autonomous state with over 1,000 years of history, including the fall of Constantinople, a subsequent Ottoman occupation, protection from Adolf Hitler, a fond interest from King Charles, and a visit from Vladimir Putin. Mount Athos has been likened to a living Byzantium, as it still follows the Byzantine 24-hour clock and the Roman Empire's Julian calendar. They're 2 weeks behind the rest of the world, and the next day begins at sunset rather than at midnight. But one ancient custom still practiced on the mountain includes the Law of Averton, and forbids any female from accessing Mount Athos, making it the only territory in the world with an all-male population. Despite the custom, the mountain is referred to as the Garden of the Mother of God. But if any woman steps foot on Mount Athos,
they could face up to a year in jail. It's not like we can, try and fandangle a source to go over there.
The closest they can get is 500 meters off the coastline, because Mount Athos is only accessible by boat.
I found this group of people who are called the Friends of Mount Athos. I reached out, and then a man responded to me. The definitive map maker on Mount Athos.
Like, he makes the maps?
Yes, he is the definitive map maker. So we have access to his maps.
This is game changer. More than just maps, he's got pages and pages of information and old photos. Like, he is clearly been studying this mountain for decades.
Yeah, he says it's like a rabbit hole. He still doesn't know everything. This mountain is insane.
So we want to take a peek into that rabbit hole, and after being given access to hundreds of photos and maps and reading hours of first-hand accounts, along with speaking to people that have worked on the mountain, we're going to unpack what life is like in this all-male territory and ask the question, why are women banned from Mount Athos? In order to understand why women aren't allowed on the mountain, we need to go back, way back. But it's hard to really pinpoint where Mount Athos began. If you go by Greek mythology, it was created during a battle between giants and the gods of Olympus. Athos, the leader of the giants, threw a great rock at the god Poseidon and missed. When the rock fell into the sea, it created the mountain. According to Orthodox Christianity, the Virgin Mary was sailing to Cyprus when her ship was blown off course and forced to anchor in the Athos Peninsula. When Mary walked ashore, she was overwhelmed by the natural beauty of the mountain and prayed to her son that it could be given to her as her own territory, leading to the name, the Garden of the Mother of God. But in order to understand the origins of Mount Athos and a large part of its historical and cultural significance today, we need to understand Byzantium. In the 4th century, monks settled on the peninsula, living as hermits in small huts and caves, until gradually they gathered into small settlements. Around the same time, there was a political divide in the Roman Empire, resulting in a split between the East and the West, with 2 capitals and 2 emperors. The West took Rome, and the East created Constantinople, or present-day Istanbul. The head of the Orthodox churches, the ecumenical patriarch, lived in Constantinople, and to this day still resides there. During the Byzantine era, Orthodox Christianity spread to the Balkans. The first monastery to survive into the modern period was recognized in the year 963, marking the start of monastic settlement. Byzantine emperors built and funded monasteries as a way to ensure their ascension to heaven, and the footpaths still used today to connect the monasteries were first commissioned by Byzantine emperors. Orthodox Christianity, and therefore Mount Athos, was heavily tied to the Byzantine Empire. After Byzantium fell to the Ottoman Empire, the monks submitted to Turkish rule from 1453 until the War of Greek Independence, a conflict that saw entire libraries burnt to the ground. They later survived a Nazi occupation during the Second World War. The monks wrote a letter to Hitler asking him to place the Holy Mountain under his protection, and he agreed. but not before attempting to take the treasures off the mountain, which ultimately didn't happen because he was too busy fighting the Russians and just forgot. But at one point there were 180 monasteries on Mount Athos with over 20,000 monks. But those buildings were lost, destroyed by the Crusades or ransacked by pirates and mercenaries. Now only 20 monasteries remain. Mount Athos has managed to survive over 1,000 years thanks to rich benefactors like emperors, princes, and kings. 20 years ago, King Charles himself initiated a great deal of restoration to the ancient cobbled footpaths that connect the monasteries. And ever since, a group of volunteers called the Friends of Mount Athos clean the paths once a year. In fact, both George Bushes and even Russian President Vladimir Putin have paid a visit to the Holy Mountain. Historical documents on ancient Mount Athos are very few, but physical evidence still remains from when the Persian king Xerxes cut a canal through the narrowest neck of the peninsula in the 5th century. Some of the greatest surviving monuments from the Byzantine era are the monastic buildings. Most of the churches on Mount Athos were erected between the 10th and 11th century, and their walls are covered by Byzantine mosaics and frescoes. A significant number of icons still used in present-day liturgies originate from Byzantine times and are still respected by monks and pilgrims. Their libraries preserve priceless embroideries and manuscripts, whilst incense holders, burners, candlesticks, and crosses could be hundreds of years old. And they're not locked away behind glass cases, but part of everyday worship.
The vast majority of treasures are that you are surrounded by them. You feel the treasures, you see them, you worship them, you venerate them. So it's an incredibly powerful feeling.
This is Chris Thomas, a member of the Friends of Athos, who regularly clears the footpaths each year.
If the treasures from the 20 monasteries were put together, they would outweigh just all of the treasures in all major cities in the world.
Because of its historic, artistic, and cultural elements, it's been described as a living record of human activities. Many scholars find their way to the mountain to study the ancient artifacts. Peter Howarth, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and a current mapmaker for the entire mountain, has visited Mount Athos for over 10 years.
And his story is like kind of wild. He's an engineer and he went there because of it. His uncle has a historical connection during World War II and hiding from the Germans. And he was there and some guy just gave him all these coordinates and just was like, here, please map it. Wow. And he's been doing it ever since.
The fact that you walk into a monastery and it was finished about the year 973 and there have been daily liturgies there every day since then. It's got this extraordinary feeling. It affects most people.
If you want a more detailed look at Mount Athos, we've got some of Peter's maps and photos for you to download for yourself on our Patreon, along with exclusive behind-the-scenes breakdowns of previous episodes. You can pay what you like at patreon.com/Faultline. And in those photos of the mountain, you will notice that the landscape itself is relatively unchanged thanks to a lack of infrastructure. Unlike the rest of Greece, this eastern peninsula remains forested and green with olive trees that are almost 800 years old and still bearing fruit. Because there are no formal roads on the mountain, pilgrims and monks travel by foot, and in some cases on the steep cliffsides by mules. There are no commercial beaches or hotels, and very little electricity. The entire mountain practices monastic farming, meaning little impact. Look at this satellite image. The entire strip remains lush and green. It's a highly remote area that has managed to remain relatively untouched compared to the rest of the world. And the law of Averton banning women even excludes female animals on the mountain, meaning that there are no cows, sheep, or chickens, no grazing animals at all. Songbirds and cats live on the peninsula, but only because they're too difficult to control. Any dairy products have to be brought onto Mount Athos from the mainland.
It's kind of developed differently to the rest of the world, to the rest of the Mediterranean. The landscape is different.
The mountain is in many ways a gateway to the past, and it attracts many scholars, non-Orthodox visitors, and numerous pilgrims each year. But access is limited. Only 100 Greek or Orthodox pilgrims and 10 non-Orthodox visitors are allowed per day. Every inch of land belongs to the monks.
Think of it as one big monastery. So in the same way a nunnery will forbid the presence of men, it's a monastery and it forbids the presence of women.
Since the entire territory belongs to the monks, they feel that they have a right to deny women access to their property. For hundreds of years, the law of Avaton explicitly forbade women, children, beardless men, and eunuchs from accessing Mount Athos, because they feared women may try to enter dressed as a man, which has happened a lot. The most famous example was by French journalist Maurice Choisy, who in 1931 dressed as a sailor and lived with the monks for a month before writing a book about it. I would love to be there when they figured out that she was a woman. And later in 1953, a Greek woman dressed as a man and snuck onto Mount Athos for 3 days, which caused Greece to pass a law prohibiting female access with a maximum penalty of 12 months imprisonment. Simply put, the reason that women aren't allowed on Mount Athos is because the law is meant to ensure celibacy and a monk's commitment to praying without distraction. But there's actually an even bigger reason why women aren't allowed on the holy mountain. As the garden of the Mother of God, Mount Athos is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and she alone represents her sex on the mountain.
Women's inability to visit Mount Athos is not anything to do with what I would call modern or even traditional sexism. It's about the Virgin Mary. It's her place. It's her garden. Literally the whole place is devoted to her.
You might be thinking, even if it's Mary's garden, which means that there are these ancient religious traditions that go back thousands of years, it's a big jump for a government to legally ban women from a place within the EU, which has gender equality and freedom of movement. Well, Mount Athos has been a semi-autonomous state since Byzantine times, and has always enforced the law of Avaton. The autonomy was ratified by the Greek state in 1926, giving the mountain a special status in the Greek constitution. And when Greece became a full member of the European Union in 1981, the Holy Mountain's autonomy was also respected. In response to arguments around gender equality and freedom of movement, Mount Athos cites religious freedom and protection of ownership as the two pillars that allow the ban to continue. And whilst members of the EU occasionally debate removing the ban, the mountain has managed to keep women out for a millennia and don't plan on changing.
What was really hard for me is finding any sort of female, women voices, because how can you talk to people about something they're not even allowed to go to? One of the things that really stood out to me was how, if you're, say, a specialist in your field, maybe you're a wildlife biologist, and you can never, ever do on-the-ground research. That is the one kind of hiccup for me about this place.
For many, if the ban were removed, it would fundamentally alter the entire area.
I've tried to imagine what it would be like if suddenly women were there, and I'm afraid it would not be Mount Athos anymore.
We are concerned solely with purity and our elevation to eternity. If women are permitted, they bring their families and their children. This place would become a tourist attraction and no longer a place of silence.
Because this is the majority of their life, prayer and devotion to God. They don't have many personal items, though a few do have mobile phones. There are no radios, newspapers, or televisions on the mountain. They do not keep up to date with the world and prefer it that way. Their day is divided into 8 hours of prayer, 8 hours of work, and 8 hours of rest. Their jobs are allocated by the abbots and could include bookbinding, orchard work, painting icons, or whatever else the monastery needs. They grow all their own food and do not eat meat and only occasionally eat fish. It's considered a very Spartan way of life. And when pilgrims visit the mountain, they are subjected to the same lifestyle. While it's difficult to consider in 2023 that there is an entire territory where women aren't allowed, it's equally difficult for Mount Athos to consider allowing women in.
If you can become a monk, you're not going to be a person that's staying up with the latest trends in Western liberalism. Let's just call it that way, right? I may not agree that it's fair in the 21st century that there are places where women can't go, but I also think that to impose a modern thought to an ancient entity would destroy the ancient entity. There's always a pressure to say, yeah, I think they should be modernized and women should be allowed. Of course, look, if someone was to offer me a way of being able to take my daughters to the mountain tomorrow, I'd take it. But I understand, and ultimately they understand, that it's not likely to happen anytime soon.
A lot of non-Orthodox people visit the Holy Mountain with militant views towards the ban on women, or out of an interest in Byzantine history. Many of them find themselves converted by the end of their trip.
Spiritually, it has a huge impact on most people that go there. You come away a different person.
The debate on whether women should be allowed to enter Mount Athos will likely never end. The future of the mountain will always be uncertain, but it remains a beacon to the pan-Orthodox world and a gateway to the past. Its historical, cultural, and artistic significance cannot be overstated, and it's the only place in the world where Byzantium has survived. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this video. Just a heads up that we're going to be taking a break from publishing long-form videos for the next 4 weeks because we're working on some really ambitious videos for you guys, which requires us to slow down our output for the next few weeks so we can just fully focus on these new pieces. We'll still be publishing shorts, and if you want some more behind the scenes content, you can check out our Patreon, and we'll be back with our next long-form video at the end of August.